Welcome to Beneath My Rib, trail mix for your spiritual journey. Your hostess is Kathleen Ann Thompson, international missionary, teacher and lecturer, and artistic director of Bellhurst Productions. Kathleen, American-born, was educated in the U.S. as well as in Europe, but has worked ecumenically the last 25 years in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, as well as China, South Africa, and South America. We hope that wherever you find yourself on your spiritual journey, Beneath My Rib will offer you some spiritual nuggets to sustain you on your way. Remember that though your journey may be long, it is never alone. And now, Kathleen.
Welcome to the podcast tonight, Beneath My Rib. Tonight we're talking about by few or by many. And our lead story here is from 1 Samuel 14:6. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, by few or by many. I bet you not too many people really know this story. I wasn't very familiar with it until I came across it in a study. And I found it to be most encouraging to my soul. Let's talk just a little bit about it. And this is the comment of Jonathan in the story, Jonathan being the princely son of Saul, the king of Israel, Israel's first king, and would have been Jonathan the next king of Israel after his father, had not God spoken to Samuel and said to anoint David to be the next king after Saul. Now, Jonathan, by all reports, was a very fine young man, very, very strong, courageous warrior, a faithful young man, full of expressive affections and loyal. His relationship with David is very well documented in the Bible, and he was faithful to his father as a warrior in Saul's army. A very lovely man, and by all accounts probably would have made a great next king had not God had something else in mind. In this case, Saul is camped at Geba, and the Philistine army is at Michmash. And Jonathan has gone out and attacked a Philistine outpost. Now, the Philistines were incredibly oppressive at this time around Israel, and they had Israel really under their thumb. They had killed all the blacksmiths in the land so that Israel could not be armed. So in effect, they had disarmed the Israelites. The Israelites had really, for the most part, except for probably Saul and Jonathan, who had swords, they were dependent on just their farm instruments for protection. And even those they couldn't sharpen unless they went down into the territory of the Philistines and paid the Philistines a lot of money. So Saul is camped with about 6,000 men, not a very big army, at Bega, waiting for the prophet Samuel to come to him, to offer the sacrifice unto the Lord. Meanwhile, Jonathan has gone out on his own and with a small force attacked an outpost. Nevertheless, it was a very good victory for Jonathan, and they did a lot of damage. This made the Philistines exceptionally furious, a lot like striking a bee's nest, yes, with a baseball bat. Well, you had better run once you do that, because you have raised the ire of the entire Philistine army. Now, the Philistine army was huge, absolutely enormous. They had 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and more foot soldiers than could be counted. So this was a huge, enormous army, very frightening, very intimidating for Saul with his meager 6,000 men. And Samuel had not arrived from Gilgal, as he promised, and now it had been 7 days since Jonathan's surprise attack on the outpost, and Saul was getting to be quite anxious about this. Now, there's another sub-story here which is very interesting, but I don't want to go into it on this podcast because it will take too long and distract us. This is the story of Saul offering the sacrifice himself, instead of waiting for Samuel to arrive. But at any rate, getting back to our story, Jonathan decided to make a little reconnaissance journey with his armor-bearer, who most likely didn't even have any armor given the situation with the blacksmiths in the territory, and to see what the Philistines were up to. Now, all the Israelites were hiding. They were in holes in the ground, having no real weapons and being faced with such an intimidating force as the Philistines. They were hiding. But Jonathan was undeterred, so they went to discover. Now, the Philistines were camped in a kind of pass leading from one area into the Michmash area where the Philistines were. And on either side of that pass where they were camped were jagged cliffs that rose quite high. So Jonathan said, let's climb up to the top of this cliff here. We'll look down on them and we'll see what they're doing and we'll show ourselves to them. You know, a little like standing up there and putting your thumbs in your ears and going, na, 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 na. And we'll just see what they say. And if they come out and shout, if they say that we should stay up there, they're coming up to us, why, then we'll stay here. But if they say, come on down here, we'll destroy you, just get into our reach, then we'll go down. So they did that. They made themselves very visible, started taunting the Philistines, yelling at them. And sure enough, the Philistines responded back and said, come down here. Just make yourself available to us down here. And so Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, we will go down there, because nothing can hinder the Lord from saving us by few or by many. Well, there certainly was a few. To say it was a few was probably a gross understatement, just being Jonathan and his little armor-bearer with only one sword between them. Nevertheless, they started climbing down the cliffside. And when they did this, the Philistines were so shocked and surprised and confused, they thought the Israelites were coming up out of their hole. And they became panicked, and they started working in confused ways, actually killing their own soldiers. And they were so confused and so panicked as they began to run and mistake who the enemy really was. Jonathan, with his sword, killed 20 of them in a very short space of territory. And this further panicked the Philistines, and they started to retreat, slashing at their own people with their own swords. Now, meanwhile, Saul, back in Gibeah, looked out and at a distance saw that the great force of the Philistine army was actually retreating. And the Israelites, hidden down in the holes in the ground, started to peek their heads up as they heard the commotion, and they started to come out and take out after the Philistines with their pitchforks and scythes and whatever else they could manage to find as a protective weapon. And before the day was over, the Philistines were completely routed, and it was a huge victory for Saul and Jonathan. And Jonathan was truly the hero of this story. Now, why did I choose this story? Well, I chose it to inspire you and me, to give us courage, so that we will know what failure looks like, and to grow our trust in God. Ephesians 1:18 says that we've been called. We have a high destiny in Christ, and that through wisdom and revelation, the Holy Spirit will make us aware of that high calling, that purpose, that destiny in Christ that we are supposed to achieve. But I'm afraid that we often stand paralyzed, like a rock-gathering moss, before the challenge of that destiny in our lives. Too many of us actually don't feel inspired. We don't feel courageous, successful, and we may even feel we don't have much trust in God, that we can get out of bed every morning and face the destiny of our life that day on earth, as well as face the spiritual goals which we would like to acquire, or face the spiritual goals which we would like to achieve in our life. Instead, we feel intimidated by the life circumstances, the challenges that meet us out there in the world every day and in our families. We feel fearful of those things that can harm us, that can take from us, that can distort our goals and our ambitions in life. We often feel hopeless, that we're not really smart enough, brave enough, courageous enough to overcome these resistances. And we certainly often feel threatened by any forward movement toward accomplishing our destiny, because failure seems to loom like a neon sign in front of us, and we don't want to fail. So we often just don't do anything. We don't move toward our destiny. We don't really grow. We just sort of tread water, like that moss gathering stone around us. Well, we have very good company. I mean, we're not alone here. David often felt this way. All we have to do is read his 150 Psalms, and we see that the majority of them start off actually by David feeling the very same way, intimidated, fearful, a failure, forgotten by God. And let's remember, David was given a high destiny, a high calling. He was to be king of Israel, anointed when he was just a boy, had an unbelievably crushing success in killing Goliath when he was very young. But then his life turns into a horror. And for years and years and years and years, David is pursued by Saul. And he is living far from the life that Samuel signaled would be his destiny. And he is feeling afraid. He is feeling disappointment. He's feeling depressed. And he cries out to God. David certainly had a heart that was not only for God, but a heart that was fully expressive. He cries out to the Lord to save him, and sometimes says, "Why did you forget me? Why are you not listening to me? Am I going to die out here? Just let me die then." But never does David end his psalms that way. But by the end of the psalm, it's almost as if by crying out in such emotion, he reveals the truth of who he knows really God is. And that is a God by few or by many will not be hindered from delivering him. And he expresses his gratitude and expectation that he will be rescued and ushered on his way toward his destiny. One of my favorite songs says that he is standing absolutely still in total silence before the one he knows, waiting as long as it will take until he is rescued. David did know who his father was. Well, I understand Jonathan's statement when he says that God will not be hindered from saving us by few or by many. I understand the many part. I mean, God is all-powerful, has unlimited resources to accomplish whatever he wants to through us. But it's much harder to understand why God would want so often to save us by few. I mean, if you have the strength and the power, why not use it? Why wait until our resources are nil, zilch, zero, and we seem to have nothing, all right, that could possibly act as a funnel for God to move through? Well, let's look at why he does this, because this is a major theme in the Bible. And God knows our name, but he wants us to know his name. And to know his name means to know in the experiential sense, to actually have experienced his name. And his name is not nomenclature, but of course it is the full description, the full content of his character, who he is, and who he is through us. For everything Christ did on the cross for us, he wants to do through us, out to the world and in us in transformation. I mean, let's look at this major theme in the Bible. We could spend a month telling the stories of those whom God saved by few. Take Gideon in Judges chapter 6. And Gideon is certainly not a man of great strength or courage. He is the youngest in his family, and his family is the weakest among the clan. And the angel of the Lord shows up to help Gideon, whose country is absolutely ravished by the Midianites. They are stealing the harvest. They are taking the livestock. They are making the Israelites' life a living hell. And Gideon, not being a courageous, strong, notable guy, is down in a wine press threshing wheat when the angel of the Lord shows up. Now, that must have been quite comical, actually, for the angel of the Lord, because to thresh wheat, one needs to go up on a hill, toss the wheat up in the air, and let the winds, cool winds and breezes on top of the hill blow the chaff off, so that the grain that can be ground falls back into the cloth. One would not go down into a wine press, for a wine press should be down, where after you tread on the grapes, the juice can run down and into containers. But here was Gideon down in a wine press, throwing up wheat. I'm sure it was landing on his head after he threw it up. Probably gave the angel of the Lord a bit of a chuckle. And he says the incredible line to Gideon, "Oh, greetings, courageous man of valor, Gideon." And Gideon has his mouth dropped open because, of course, Gideon knows only too well that he is basically pretty much a failure of a person and a coward hiding down here just trying to save a few grains of barley or wheat from the Midianites' grasp. But there he is, and the angel repeats it again. "Hail, O mighty man of valor." You see, God doesn't think of us as we think of us, but sees us according to the high destiny to which he has called us. Gideon spent some time arguing with the angel of the Lord about this, but in the end, the angel of the Lord tells him, "I've come to help you because you, Gideon, mighty man of courage, are going to go down there into that valley, and you are going to slaughter all of those Midianites." Now, the Midianites were like the Philistines. They were huge, enormous force with equipment and arms that the Israelites could only dream of. So to say something like this to a standing army of 20,000 would have been truly remarkable, but to say it to one man, youngest of his family, weakest of all the tribes, who's hiding at this point in a wine press, was truly a remarkable statement. Well, the angel of the Lord is persuasive, and Gideon throws a few fleeces out to test whether the angel of the Lord is truthful, and in the end, Gideon summons an army, blows the trumpets for Israel, and the army in reserve out in the country gathers. And when they come to their place, they are about 33,000. And the angel of the Lord shows up again and says, Gideon, I'm sorry, this is just too many men. Let all those who are afraid to go down there and face the Midianites, those who are trembling, let them go home. Send them home. And Gideon says, are you kidding me? 33,000 against tens of thousands of warriors down there? Nevertheless, the angel of the Lord was clear, and so 22,000 left that day. Can you imagine that? 22,000. Gideon was left with about 10,000 men. And he is still seeking confirmation from the angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord then says, this is still just too many. I cannot deliver you with this many men. Gideon, you just have too many men. He said, and I'm going to tell you how to get rid of them. I love this story. So he says, you take them down to the river to drink, and those that get on their knees and put their head down and take up the water with their mouth, you get rid of all those men. But those who lift the water up to their mouth and lap it, those you keep. Because you see, of course, those are the alert ones. Those are the smart, watching ones. The others are dull, and they're not going to do you any good anyway, so get rid of them. So that day, 9,700 of the 10 left because they were drinking water the wrong way. And so Gideon is left with 300 men. I mean, this is just laughable. He is afraid, obviously. I'm sure each of us would be terrified. And the angel of the Lord said, well, I see that you're afraid, so here's what you do. You go down tonight, in the middle of the night, in the dark. You sneak down to the camp of the Midianites, and you listen to them. Gideon says, excuse me, but do you happen to realize that it's them that I'm afraid of? And you're asking me to go down unarmed into their camp, right? And walk into their camp and listen to them? And the angel of the Lord said, yes, and so to his credit, Gideon did so. And when he went down there, he snuck behind a tent and heard two soldiers talking. And the one said to the other, you know what? I'm really nervous, anxious. I had this terrible dream last night. I dreamed that a loaf of bread, a huge loaf of bread, came rolling down the mountain last night and crashed into my tent and killed me. And the other soldier says, oh, this is really bad. You know what that means? That means that that's Gideon and his army. He's coming after us tomorrow, and he's going to destroy us all. Well, that was a surprise to Gideon. So Gideon takes himself back up the hill in stealth disguise and gets to his army of 300 men and says, here's what we're going to do. Gideon's full of courage now. Gideon's full of strength and hope now. And he says, here's what we're going to do. They are terrified down there. They are scared to death down there. We are going to leave now in the night before it's daylight. He gave everyone a trumpet, a lighted torch, and a jar to put over that torch. He said, we are going down there. We're going to sneak up on them in the middle of the night by surprise. And when I give the signal, you are all going to blow the trumpet. And then you're going to break the jar on top of your torch, and we will attack. And indeed, Gideon did that. And Gideon that night, so confused, so sent the Midianite army into panic that they ended up killing each other and retreating. And once again, it was a total victory. By just a very few, Gideon was able to rout the entire Midianite army through the deliverance of God. David and Goliath. Here was David, this little littlest son, who wasn't even called to the family congress where Samuel was to anoint the next king of Israel. Samuel went through all the brothers who were all warriors for Saul and in the army. And David, he was just out with the sheep and running snack food errands for the brothers in the army. And Samuel said, wait a minute, don't you have anybody else? And father said, well, we have just this little guy. He's out with the sheep, and he's just a runner, okay? He's not significant here. These are the warriors. These are the brothers. And Samuel said, no, bring this other one. And when David arrived, he saw immediately this was God's appointed king of Israel, next after Saul. And he anointed him. And David didn't step into that destiny at that moment, far from it. In fact, his first act wasn't even on the agenda. He simply was aware of the absolute despicable rebuke that Goliath was giving to his God, and the insulting behavior of this giant toward the Lord, and became indignant and incensed and said, why is nobody attacking this guy? Why is nobody shutting this giant up, killing him? As he went to deliver his honey cakes and raisins to his brothers. And they all said, well, nobody's going to attack him. He's too big. He's too fearful. And he's not the only one. There's a lot of other giants as well behind him. And, well, this can't be. Absolutely this can't be. My God will deliver me. And he went down and said, well, I'll kill him then. Now, Saul tried to fix him into a huge armor. Saul was a very, very, very tall man, a very big man, and David was not at all big at this point. And so he tries to fit him with his own armor, Saul did. But of course, David couldn't even walk probably in this armor, or much less lift the sword and bear the shield. And so he got frustrated with that and said, listen, just take all this back, okay? I don't have much. I just have a small thing. It's my slingshot. But I'm good with that. I'm really good with that. That's what I protect my sheep with. And I've killed a lion. I'm telling you, I'm good with this slingshot. Now, God will be with me. God will save me, as Jonathan said, by few, just my little slingshot, or by many. But in this case, it's going to be by few because I don't have anything else, and I can't wear your armor, Saul. So David goes out, we know the story, and with his little slingshot, David kills this enormous giant, giving everybody in the army a huge boost of courage and faith, and they went on to take on the other giants. Another, by the way, that story is in 1 Samuel 17. Another nice story of hope and miraculous deliverance by God by just the few is King Jehoshaphat, who was walled inside the city of Jerusalem, surrounded on all sides by major armies, the Amorites, the Moabites. He was totally surrounded, not just by one, but by many armies, much as the Israelites were in 1967 in the Six-Day War, where there were three huge nations surrounding Israel trying to attack it. And this story, by the way, is in 2 Chronicles 20. But Jehoshaphat was terrified, shaking in his boots inside the city, and said, I don't know what we will do. We don't have anything close to an army that could even begin to deliver us from these armies camped outside of our walls. What do we do, God? And God spoke and said, this day I will fight for you. Don't be afraid and don't be discouraged by this vast army, the many of the other side. The battle isn't yours, it's God's. Now, here's what I want you to do. You send out the singers and the musicians and the prophets, the few. And then you and the army take your posts around and simply watch, because I will fight for you this day. And it's a glorious story. It's a wonderful story. And indeed, God routs the enemy completely that day without the Israelites lifting a spear. And they come in for the plunder at the end. This is a huge example for us of the power of declaring who God is to our enemy. So what were the singers and the musicians and the prophets doing, marching out ahead? Well, they were declaring, they were speaking who God is, what his name means to the enemy. And this is one of the very first things that we should be doing when we face the challenge of our opposition, declaring that God is faithful, all-powerful, and will deliver us. Now, in the New Testament, we get into all kinds of stories there too. Just a few examples before we move on. Think about Jesus with the destiny to change the entire Western civilization. He's going to save all of mankind and change the entire Western civilization for thousands of years. And who does he choose to help him do that? Just a dozen rather awkward, clumsy, personality-challenged men. None of them with great plum that they could tout themselves as having resources of money or wisdom or education or status or governmental privilege. No, these were just 12 quite ordinary men. And yet, with those men, Jesus, through them, changed the entire Western civilization. After, of course, he saved all of mankind. When he went to feed the 5,000 and later on the more than 5,000, all right, he did so not by summoning up miraculously a long table of food. No, he just took a few tiny little fishes. He took some little kid's lunch, okay, and multiplied it miraculously so that all could eat of that tiny little lunch. And just to make his point really clear, there were a lot of leftovers afterwards. When he chose somebody to discover the greatest discovery that man has ever made in the history of the world, which was that Christ rose from the dead. Who did he choose? 3 women. Women who in that society, in that day, had absolutely no credibility as legal witnesses whatsoever. The 3 most unlikely people to give a truthful witness of a miracle like that, 3 women. God loves to do this. He loves to do this. Because what they found out, and what we all find out, and what David found out, was that God is faithful and capable to save us. Not because of all the resources we have, or because how powerful we are, or how educated we are, or how successful we've been in life, or how anything we are, but because he wants to save us. He wants to deliver us. He loves us in spite of our personality-challenged beings, in spite of our record of failure, in spite of our ignorance, our weaknesses. And he wants us to know his heart is for us. And that our own strength, our own resources, our own accomplishments can never buy his power or his love. We can't prove our worth to him. The proof of our worth to him is in his act of sacrifice on that cross for us. But there are some other benefits, and let's look at those for a minute, with God saving us by just the fewest of resources. Well, one of those things is that we often have too much, as Gideon did. All those men who were trembling, those 22,000, were fearful. What kind of soldiers would they have been? What kind of help would they have been on the battlefield? Better without them. And those who were drinking water like a dog with their head in the river could have been overcome and ambushed in a half a second. They weren't alert. They weren't ready for battle. They weren't battle ready. So often God chooses to winnow down our resources, our own resources, because actually we have too many. They're a waste. They're not the best, and they're not the richest in the sense of value for a job. And this happens over and over in my life, where I plan a certain objective and gather my resources for it. And then as I get closer and closer, God keeps stripping me of this resource and that. Oh, I didn't have as much money as I thought. Oh, I don't have as many people as I thought I would. Oh, I don't have the facility that I thought I would. And temptation to panic is real as you see the deadline approach for the accomplishment of your project. But then you start declaring, but God is faithful. God is faithful. He is faithful. He will deliver me. He will come through in whatever resources are left to me. And he will overcome the resistance, and he will succeed. And then you find out, not only does that happen, but it's better. It's better than it would have been with all those resources. The venue you had picked, even though it was bigger and more equipped, actually was not right for the kind of audience that eventually ended up coming. The people you thought were absolutely needed for the project ended up to be a little bit of dead weight. And actually, you did more with less. It was more creative. It was a much better project in the end. And you didn't need all that money. You would have spent it on things that actually would have been useless when you came down to it. Because in the end, you didn't need those things. So sometimes we just have too much, and God knows it. Other times, it's that he wants us to know that he cares for us, even when we have nothing to offer him. I think about how many times he delivered me from real danger in the years I lived ignoring him, actually denying his existence and giving not even his name a place in my vocabulary. Years. And yet, miraculously, he kept coming in to save me. Because he cares, because he loves me, because he really wants to. Now I look back on those times with such a poignant repentance on my part, but such an incredible awareness of how great God's love is for me. Also, another reason, God is revealed when he saves and delivers by a few, and he gets the glory. God is revealed in the kind of deliverance we get, because it's not by our own resources, it's not by the many, by the expected. We would expect to be saved by the many, by the powerful, by the rich, by the everything. But when God delivers us by nothing, it seems, he is the one that gets glorified. God revealed in our deliverance is God glorified. And he saves us from the pride of life. because we have a lust for ego-bursting praise. And that power that comes with pride corrupts our sense of humility. It corrupts us. Then we don't even know where the power to deliver came from. That's why Jesus said to the fighting brothers, you know what? Stop fighting over who wants to be on my right and who wants to be on my left. Stop fighting for power, privilege, status. Sit down here. And he took out a bowl and, like a servant, washed the dirty, smelly, calloused, cracking feet of his disciples and said, real power is in being a servant. Real glory is in serving. God saves us from boasting of our own accomplishments and losing the humility which brings us into intimate relationship with Him. Also, you're inspired. You get inspired yourself with courage. Like Gideon. He suddenly became courageous, as the angel said he was. He became courageous because he saw that God had prepared the Midianites in fear, and that actually God was going to be there with him and his 300 men. And we're then transformed. We become stronger. We become more full of faith. And then we start taking on challenges differently. You know, confrontation to challenges straight on is actually a great thing for us. From a standpoint of just being human, do you know that when we face challenges and decide to take them on and fight for them, the brain actually has a new thing which happens to it. It makes new little synaptic connections, so to speak. It actually creates something new to deal with those challenges. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Supply and demand, okay? Or on-demand brain activity, on-demand brain systems that are designed to take on challenges. We know that from antibiotics. If the person is taking too many antibiotics, rather than strengthening the body, it actually diminishes the immune system. And the body becomes actually on its own much less able to fight the challenge. But the body that fights the infection, fights the virus, fights the bacteria, fights the healing process all on its own, it becomes stronger. And every time the body wins, every time the body vacates a virus, a bacteria from its systems and gets rid of the enemy, it becomes stronger. That's a great thing. It's meant to do that. It's designed to do that. We know in psychoanalysis, this is often what psychoanalysis has as one of its goals, to get the patient to face the challenge, the dark monster in the back of the dark cave that it doesn't want to look at. And when the patient finally does do that and faces it and can find out the origin of that, it gains strength to overcome the fear, the anxiety, the guilt, the shame, whatever it is that's attached to that origin. And it also then inspires others, just like in Jonathan's story. When the Israelites saw the Philistines begin to run and retreat, and it was just just Jonathan and his armor bearer out there, they came out of the holes. They said, "Hey, grab the pitchfork, Ma, let's go." And it inspired others. There are two stories I'd like to share with you concerning this whole subject and facing your challenges, because they were pivotal. They remain still in my life as pillars. The first one was when I was about 13. I was in an equestrian competition event in Colorado Springs. I rode horses, and I had a high jumper, and I was in a 3-day competition with a lot of course, other horses. But my horse was rather unusual for the events that I was in because it wasn't of the thoroughbred breed. Instead, it was just a little Morgan, a small horse. A Morgan's a rather short horse and kind of an all-round farm horse, and yet hook him to the buggy on Sunday, he'll take you to church. But certainly not a thoroughbred. Those racing horses with the long legs and the long bodies and that are meant for hunting and jumping. And most of the people riding in this event that I was in on the third day had very, very fine, expensive horses and were from the elite society in Denver. And I was a little bit of an anomaly with my little Morgan because I had made it over 2 days into this champion event on Sunday afternoon. And so this was a most challenging event. We had, I think, 8 or 9 jumps to do on a course. And the girl riding in front of me had a very expensive horse. She was actually a very good friend of mine. And she went out ahead of me. And I was in the warm-up paddock warming up my horse. I was to be next on the rostrum. And we were riding for the championship of these 3 days. And she took off. She had a pretty good ride. She got down to the last jump, which is a very difficult jump. It had a small water moat in front of it. It was a brick wall, solid brick wall, with a rail on top of it. So this was quite an unforgiving jump. If you missed, you were likely to have real problems. And this was the last jump on the course. She rode toward it. The horse took off and caught his front hoof on the top rail. And when it went off, it got spindled sideways and stuck in such a way that the horse couldn't clear his legs from it. And he went head over hooves, I guess you would say, flipped over the top of the jump and basically landed on my friend, on her. It was a very, very serious accident. She was unconscious. My mother, who was a nurse, came running up and actually did emergency treatment on her until the ambulance could come. It was a very, very tense time. It was probably a half hour or so before the ambulance got her, took care of her, and was taking her off to the hospital. It was of such a serious nature. She was not conscious, and if I remember correctly, she was unconscious for several months and in a coma. My mother was terrified, of course, and I was terrified because I knew that when they started the competition again, I would be the next rider. And indeed, as the ambulance went out the gate, the announcer came on and said, "We will continue this event, and the next rider up is number," and of course it was me. They opened the paddock gate for me, and I went out. And I think I didn't have any blood at all. I would like to say my blood ran cold, but actually, I don't believe I had any blood in my body. It was, if I did, it was all drained out somewhere. I couldn't feel any. I was ice cold. My hands were shaking. And I was just terrified. I couldn't swallow. And I went out and looked at the first jump, and I stopped, and my mother was there. And she looked up at me, and she said, in a very compassionate way, "You don't have to, but you have to live with your choice." And I'll tell you why that was so important in a minute. But I made my choice. I looked at that jump, and I grabbed a hold of my horse's mane. I got myself up on my stirrups, and I kicked my horse very strongly, and I don't remember anything after that. I headed him toward the jump, closed my eyes, and he went around the course all by himself, I think. I don't remember having a modicum of control over him. I just kept turning him toward a jump. He did this all on his own and won the championship. We had a perfect ride that day, won the championship. But I didn't do anything, and I'm serious about that. I just hung on to him for dear life, and the only thing I could say to my credit was I didn't stop him or get off him. It was a most incredible moment. It gave me so much courage in my life. I will never forget it. I was never the same after that. I began to think of myself as a courageous person, a person who could take risks, who wasn't afraid. Now, the reason that this was important, what my mother said to me, and the reason she said it was because of another story that happened 7 years before when I was about 6 years old. And we were at a gymnastic meet, more like a tumbling meet, sort of just for little kids. And in my school, my public school, I was in tumbling, a little bit of beginning gymnastics, and I was pretty good. I had a talent for it. So they took me to a regional competition with other little kids, and my mom was there, and I had a couple of tumbling events to do and cartwheel events to do, and I did them really well. And I was happy with that. And then my teacher came over and said, I would really like you to do this last event. It's a little bit more advanced, but you've done so well, and I'm sure you could do it. So I really want you to do this. And this was also a tumbling event, but before you got a chance to do your somersaults, you had to dive headfirst over a rolled-up mat, which they put at the beginning of the run. So you had to dive over that mat and then come down and do your somersault forward and back. And I found this to be very intimidating. I had never done it before, and I was afraid, and I didn't think I could do it. And I was really afraid. And my teacher encouraged me for a while, and then my mother encouraged me for a while. And my mother was never pushy or demanding or guilt-tripping me, nothing like that. She was a very wise woman. But I dug my heels in, and I said no. And so we went home from the event. And on the way home, my mother never, ever shamed me. Never, ever did she say, oh, you should have done that, and why didn't you do that? She didn't have to, because she could just tell by the look on my face. And I can tell you that for the next 7 years, the shame of being a coward for me was present every single day and shaped many of my choices and how I thought about myself. And I just knew that I had been a coward that day, that this wasn't a hugely dangerous event. I could have done it. But I was cowardly, and I hated that. And I hated the feeling of it every time I thought about it. And it really stuck with me all those years until that day in Colorado Springs. And that's the reason she said, you don't have to, but you have to live with your decision. And I wasn't going to live with another cowardly decision. I was going to face that fear that day, and I did. So what are the reasons why we often don't move toward our destiny, toward our high calling, and believe God will deliver us, even if we don't have any resources, even if there's just such a few anything left around us that we can imagine God could use to deliver us. Well, I think there are 4 reasons we can look at. They spell fold, F-O-L-D. The first one, F, is fear. Actually, we're just plain afraid. Afraid of what we don't know, afraid we'll fail, afraid we'll be overcome, afraid that people will shame us. And fear weakens us, absolutely weakens us. And I remember a wonderful man still in my life, Pastor Valdis Tsiverts, pastor in Latvia. And when I first came there, he told me the story of walking to his church every day. He lived in a little tiny village about 5 kilometers away from the church, didn't have a car, and so he would walk to the church every day. And he could walk along some major roads and get there. It was a little bit longer. Or he could cut across a forest. This forest was quite wild and dark and uncivilized. But he could walk through this dense forest and cut off some time. And he said, I walk through this forest. I choose to do that every day because I'm training myself to face fear. Because I know what God has called me to do is going to require great courage in my life. So I'm training myself to face fear. So when I walk through the forest, and it's dark and it's dense and full of a lot of wild things, and I hear something that is producing fear in me, he said, I train myself not to walk away, try to hide from it, or run away. He said, but I turn around and I walk toward it, and I face it. I see what it is. And in this way, I'm training myself that I will face the challenges that God will allow to come before me as I move toward what He's called me to do, and that He will be faithful. And one day, when I was facing something and complaining to God and quaking in fear, the Holy Spirit spoke and said to me, I forbid you to be afraid. I forbid you. Because I didn't give you a spirit of fear. You were given a spirit of a sound mind in Christ. And if you turn away from that which challenges you, you will not see the weapon I have put before you, between you and the challenge, with which, if you pick it up, you will be delivered. You will overcome. But if you turn and walk away or hide, you will never see what I put in front of you to conquer the enemy with. Second reason, O, for offense. Offense, carrying the offense on us that somebody has put there, makes us brittle, uncreative, narrow in thinking. It makes us a victim. It puts us in an absolutely, a straitjacket, which crushes life. Carrying offense crushes life. Living with an offense all the time is so destructive and produces noxious and toxic gas in our being, which separates us from the forgiveness, the full forgiveness of God. There's a reason why in the Lord's Prayer God said, and put them next to each other, forgive me my trespasses as I forgive the offenses done to me. They go hand in hand. So when we carry offense and carry that unforgiveness in us, not only does it make us brittle, kill creativity and problem solving and kill courage, but it also separates us from the forgiveness of God for our own offenses. It's a killing burden, and we should never be carrying offenses, but releasing them at the foot of the cross to Christ. Judgment is and justice is His. We need to get on with the business of living life abundant. L, lust. Lust is a form of self-medication. You see, we have an insatiable drive to saturate ourselves with indulgent pleasures in order to take our mind off the empty hole of need in us. We become so addicted to these forms of pleasure that they become our idols and we become their slaves. And we become spiritually blind to the need to actually grow in strength, self-discipline, endurance, self-sacrifice, and meet the challenge of that which resists us, resists our pathway to achieve the high calling we're called to. Lust weakens us and makes us dull like a doughy biscuit. You see, we all, without God, have a hole, empty, that is never, ever silenced in its crying out to be filled with God. It pulses like a subterranean light, just flashing, making us aware that the emptiness is there, that the emptiness is calling to be fully satisfied. David says, I awake in the morning and I look fully into your face, and then I am fully satisfied. We will never be satisfied. There are no pleasures of this world that can satisfy us, whether they be food, sex, drink, power, status, goods, relationships. Nothing will satisfy us completely. And as we try to fill that hole with those things, the same way somebody tries to self-medicate their symptoms, we only become like druggies, addicted to them and then enslaved by them, weakened and dulled by them. D, the last one, deception. What is deception? Deception's a lack of truth. Who is the truth? Jesus is the truth. And knowing the truth, knowing Jesus experientially, who He is, experiencing His character in relational life with Him, and knowing and understanding the Father's design for His creation. Knowing this causes us to develop not just faith, but to develop courage and the ability to challenge ourselves in self-discipline and endurance and patience to achieve the calling that God has called us to, that high destiny. When we know the truth, then the father of lies, who uses society, culture, and governments as his mouthpiece, can't deceive us, can't discourage us, can't weaken us, can't deceive us. But we remain strong. We know that by few or by many, our God can't be hindered from delivering us. So how do we do this? So I'm just going to finish up here with actually, I think, the cherry on the sundae, the best part. So let's say we're facing a gigantic challenge and we seem to have no resources to conquer it. We seem to have no resources to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and make this thing go away. Well, first we go to Jehoshaphat and the story of Jerusalem besieged by the armies. We send out the musicians, the singers, and the prophets. We send out the declaration of the truth. We don't believe the lies of the enemy, that God has forgotten us, that he's weak, that he can't do anything, that we are too insignificant, too much of a failure. No, we send out the proclamation givers, the singers, the dancers, the musicians, the prophets, and we declare the truth of who God is, that indeed our God will fight for us, our God will save us. Then we go to Ecclesiastes 9:10. I'm going to read it to you out of a modern translation. I like this translation very much. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all of your might. For there is no work, no plan, no knowledge, no wisdom in the grave where you go. So do it now, today, this hour, with what you have. The grave may come in the next moment. You see, God puts things in our heart, doesn't he? He inspires us with destiny, with calling, with vision. And he says he will give us the desires of our heart. But what we're in charge of is not what's in our heart. God put that there. That, as David says in Psalm 16, I will commit to him and its timing. And in its timing and in God's perfect plan, he will give us the desires of our heart. What I have to do when I open my eyes in the morning is to look and see what is in my hand to do today. As those Israelites didn't have swords in their hands, they only had pitchforks or scythes or sickles or a club. David only had his slingshot. Little boy only had his fish. We take what is in our hand today and we do that. And we don't just do it. We don't just walk through our job today, but we do it with all of our might. So I have it in my hand today to make sure my children and my husband go off today with a really good breakfast in their tummies. And I'm going to love them and nourish them for these 15 minutes. So when they go off today, they have that in them. They know I care. They know I love them. We do what is in our hand to do today. I'm not just going to write up these reports for my boss, but I'm going to put them in such a form that will save him time. He didn't expect me to do that. But this will save him time. I'm going to do a little bit more here and put them in such a way that he can efficiently get to them before that big board meeting. And they'll be impressive at the board meeting because I'm going to put some extra things on them. I'm going to do what I can do today. And I'm going to do it with all of my heart. Because it's what's in my hand. It's what God gave me to do today. He will take care of giving me the desires of my heart according to his timing and his plan. And he will deliver me by few or by many. Sometimes we say, well, I don't have anything in my hand. I don't think I have anything in my hand. But it's not true. It's an illusion. It's an illusion. You're letting the world tell you what should be in your hand today. We all have something to do in our hand today. We have to live life according to Christ. It's kind of like looking at the stars, when I was young and we would sit by the campfire in the forest, we'd look out up at the stars and they seemed to be just still, like little diamonds in the sky, and just there as if somebody put them all on just to shine down on me. But of course those stars aren't still, are they? That's an illusion. Those stars are spinning through the space atmosphere out there at such an enormous speed we can't even speak about it. Because those stars are actually suns. They're dying suns. They're just taking a long time to die. And as they die and get smaller and smaller, they are releasing off of them. They're throwing off of them huge, enormous amounts of gases from their nuclear centers. And then after so many billions of years, they'll be finished, and they'll end up to be a black hole. They're not standing still. They're shining up there. It's an illusion that they're standing still. And it's an illusion you don't have anything in your hands to do today. That's an illusion. You're not standing still. And you're like that dying star, because we're all dying, a sun. We're all dying suns. We're dying sons of God ever since the garden episode. The only difference between us and that dying sun up there is we're not going to end up a black hole, but we're going to be reinstated into the sun and have eternal power in him. Meanwhile, we're not standing still. We're throwing off stuff that comes from doing what's in our hands this day with all of our might. We're throwing off the remembrances of the Son, Jesus. We're throwing off remembrances of his love, his care, his endurance, his patience, his self-discipline, his power, his strength, his courage, and on and on. And we are being transformed through Christ into that high calling, that high destiny. If we do what is in our hands to do every moment, we will shine, and we will give off energy and warmth to everyone around us. And we won't be aware that we are dying. If we were just standing still because we are paralyzed by fear, calcified by offense, obesely stuck and drowning in our lust, or wandering in confusion because we don't know the truth, then we will be aware that we are dying.
Thanks for being here. Keep in touch with us. We love to hear from you. And if you're a theater enthusiast, you can check out my other podcast channel, Whispers in the Wings, where we converse about theater techniques. Till our next episode on Beneath My Rib, this is Kathleen Ann Thompson, wishing you inspiration and strength on your spiritual journey. You've been listening to Kathleen Ann Thompson on Beneath My Rib. Please visit us at www.bellhurst.com.